The air at the Miller County Equipment Auction in April of '74 was thick with the smell of diesel, damp earth, and something else. Unbridled optimism. Corn was pushing $4 a bushel, a number that would have sounded like a fairy tale just a few years earlier. Farmers who'd spent their lives one bad crop away from ruin were suddenly walking with a swagger, their pockets heavy with cash and their heads full of ambition. They weren't just buying equipment, they were buying a piece of the new American dream, forged in steel and painted red or green. I was standing near the back, my hand shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jacket, watching the spectacle. My name is John Miller. My face was already leathered from 38 years under the Nebraska sun, and my hands bore the permanent tattoos of grease and hydraulic fluid that no amount of soap could ever scrub away. I wasn't there for the new iron. I was there for the ghosts, the machines that had built this county and were now being cast aside for bigger, shinier things. The auctioneer's patter was a hypnotic rhythm, a song of horsepower and progress. The main attraction was a brand new International Harvester 1066, still gleaming under the spring sun. It had a fully enclosed cab with tinted glass, air conditioning, and a radio. To the men gathered around, it wasn't just a tractor. It was a throne room on wheels. The bidding was fast and furious, driven by men whose credit was as good as gold at the Farmers National Bank. The final nod went to Richard Peterson, or Rich, as everyone called him. He was a few years younger than me, with soft hands and a smile that always looked like he was selling you something. He'd inherited a good quarter section from his father, and, in the last 3 years, had leveraged it into a sprawling empire of rented ground and government loans. He climbed up into the cab of his new prize, waving to the crowd like a conquering hero. His gaze swept over the assembled farmers and landed on me. I was standing next to a tired-looking Farmall M. Its red paint faded to a dull orange, its narrow front end looking almost delicate next to the behemoths on display. One of its rear tires was weather-cracked, and a greasy film coated the engine block. Rich leaned out of his climate-controlled cab, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. "Still playing with relics, John? You can't farm 1,000 acres with a museum piece." A wave of chuckles rippled through the men around him. They weren't mean-spirited, not really. It was the easy laughter of men who felt they were on the winning side of history. I didn't say anything. I just ran my hand over the Farmall's rusty fender. I knew this tractor. It had belonged to old man Hemmings, who'd bought it new in '49. He'd used it to raise 3 kids and put them all through college. He'd taken care of it, and it had taken care of him. It had history. It had character. More importantly, it had a simple, bulletproof 4-cylinder engine that I could rebuild in my own shop with a set of wrenches and a torque guide. I ignored Rich and his audience and waited for the auctioneer to move on. When the Farmall M came up, the crowd thinned. The bidding was slow, almost pathetic. I got it for $350. As I went to pay the clerk, Rich walked past, clapping me on the shoulder. "Goodbye, John," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That'll make a nice yard ornament." I just nodded and handed over my cash. I didn't have to sign a loan document that stretched out for 7 years. I didn't have to pledge my land and my future to the bank. I just paid my money, hitched the old tractor to the back of my grain truck, and headed for home. My farm wasn't much to look at, not compared to the sprawling operations that were popping up all over the county. Just the original 320 acres my grandfather had homesteaded. The house was small, the barn needed a new coat of paint, but everything on it was mine. Every bolt, every board, every bushel of corn in the bin. My main workhorse was a John Deere 4020, a '68 model. I'd bought it used from a retiring neighbor 10 years ago, and had made the final payment in '72. That tractor was a part of me. I knew every groan, every whine, every hiccup of its 6-cylinder diesel engine. It didn't have a cab or a radio, but it started every time I turned the key, and it pulled what I asked it to pull. My father, a man who'd survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, had drilled one lesson into my head until it was part of my bone marrow. The bank is a partner you can't fire. They eat first, whether your crop is good or bad. While other men saw debt as a tool, a ladder to climb higher and faster, I saw it as a chain, and I wanted no part of it. That evening, I stood in my shop, the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows. The old Farmel M sat in the center of the concrete floor, looking tired but dignified. My wife Sarah came out with a cup of coffee. She looked at the tractor, then at me. "Another one, John?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Don't you have enough work to do?" "This one's different, Sarah," I said, sipping the hot coffee. "This one's got good bones, and it was cheap." She smiled, a weary but understanding smile. "Everything you buy is cheap. The Petersons just bought a new boat. They're taking it to the lake this summer." I didn't answer. I just looked at the old tractor. Rich Peterson could have his boat, his new tractor, his sprawling acres built on a foundation of banknotes. I had this, a piece of history, a promise of honest work, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing that when you go to bed at night, the only person you owe is yourself. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like me? A fellow who stuck to his guns with old iron while everyone else was chasing the latest and greatest? Let me know down in the comments what kind of tractor he ran. Was it a Farmel, a John Deere, an Oliver? I read every single one. The first order of business with the Farmel was to see what I was really dealing with. Sentiment doesn't plough a field. I spent the better part of a day just cleaning it, scraping away 25 years of accumulated grease, dirt, and spilled oil with a putty knife and a bucket of kerosene. Underneath the grime, the engine block was solid, no cracks that I could see. That was the first good sign. I pulled the plugs. They were fouled, black with carbon and oil, telling a story of incomplete combustion and worn rings. I put a compression gauge on each cylinder. The first 3 were low, around 90 pounds. The last one was barely 60. That settled it. The head had to come off. There's a certain intimacy to tearing down an old engine. You're not just unbolting metal, you're peeling back layers of time. I drained the oil, a thick black sludge that smelled of burnt hydrocarbons and neglect. The radiator coolant was a rusty soup. I disconnected the fuel line from the sediment bowl, releasing the stale, varnish-like odor of ancient gasoline. Each bolt was a battle. I'd soak it in penetrating oil, tap it with a hammer to break the rust's grip, and then lean into the wrench with a slow, steady pressure, praying I wouldn't hear that sickening snap of sheared steel. Finally, with the manifold carburetor and valve cover removed, I got to the head bolts. Using a long breaker bar, I worked in the correct sequence, crisscrossing from the center out, breaking each one free with a groan of protest. The cast iron head was heavy. I lifted it off and set it on my workbench. The story it told wasn't pretty. Carbon buildup on the pistons was thick as a nickel, and the cylinder walls showed signs of scoring. The number 4 exhaust valve was clearly burnt, its edges chipped and pitted. I spent the next 3 days on that cylinder head. I pulled each valve, keeping them in order in a numbered rack. I cleaned the ports with wire brushes, spun by my electric drill until the raw metal shone through. Then came the delicate work of lapping the valves. I'd put a dab of coarse grinding compound on the valve seat, insert the valve, and use a hand tool with 2 suction cups to spin it back and forth. The sound it made was a gritty whisper, the sound of metal being meticulously reshaped. After the coarse compound, I'd switch to fine, working it until I had a perfect, clean, grey ring on both the valve and the seat. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but it was the only way to ensure a perfect seal. While the head was off, I decided to go deeper. I dropped the oil pan and took a look at the bottom end. The rod bearings had some play, so I replaced them, plastigauging each one to make sure the clearance was just right. The pistons and sleeves were the real problem. I knew they needed to be replaced, but a full overhaul kit was expensive. So I did what men like me did back then. I made do. I used a ridge reamer to cut the carbon lip at the top of the cylinders, then carefully pushed the pistons out. I bought a new set of cast iron rings and a cylinder hone. Honing those sleeves was an art. Too fast and you'd get an uneven finish. Too slow and you'd take off too much metal. I attached the hone to my drill, oiled the stones, and ran it up and down in each sleeve, creating a crosshatch pattern that would allow the new rings to seat properly. The smell of honing oil and metal filings filled the shop. Finally, it was time for reassembly. New head gasket, new manifold gaskets, everything torqued down to spec in the proper sequence. I set the valve lash, feeling for that slight drag on the feeler gauge. I cleaned the carburetor, blowing out every tiny jet and passage with compressed air. I filed the points on the magneto and set the gap. The last step was setting the timing. I turned the engine over by hand until the number 1 piston was at top dead center, then lined up the marks on the magneto impulse coupling. It was a ritual, a series of small, precise steps that, if done correctly, would bring the dead machine back to life. After filling it with fresh oil and coolant, I put a gallon of gas in the tank. I stood back for a moment, wiping my greasy hands on a rag. Then I climbed onto the steel seat, pulled the choke, and hit the starter rod with my heel. The engine turned over once, twice, then coughed. A puff of black smoke shot out of the straight pipe exhaust. I pushed the choke in halfway and tried again. It coughed again, then caught. The first tentative pops turned into a steady, rhythmic cadence, that unmistakable pop-pop-pop of a Farmel M at idle. It wasn't the smooth roar of Rich Peterson's new 1066. It was a rougher, more agricultural sound. It was the sound of reliability, the sound of something paid for. That spring, the whispers followed me from the diner to the co-op. They saw me out in the field on my open station 4020, a cloud of dust my only companion, while Rich Peterson sat in his air-conditioned cab listening to the radio. They saw me cultivating my corn with the newly revived Farmel M, and they shook their heads. "Poor John," I heard one day at the parts counter. "He's working himself into an early grave with that junk. If he'd just borrow some money, get himself some decent equipment, he could take it easy." The scorn wasn't just about the machinery. It was about a way of life. I was a relic, a holdout from a bygone era. They were the future, a future of big loans, big equipment, and big acres. The county extension agent even stopped by one afternoon. He was a young kid, fresh out of college, full of charts and figures. He sat at our kitchen table and tried to show me how I could double my net worth in 5 years if I just took out a loan to buy the 80 acres bordering my farm to the south. "The bank is eager to lend, Mr. Miller," he said, pushing a brochure across the table. "Land values are only going up. You can't lose." Land is only worth what you can pull out of it, I told him, and you can't pull much out of it when you're paying 20% of your crop to the bank. He left, looking disappointed, as if I were a lost cause. That was the prevailing wisdom. If you weren't borrowing, you weren't growing. And if you weren't growing, you were dying. The struggle wasn't just with public opinion. It was with the iron itself. One hot afternoon in the middle of planting soybeans, the hydraulic pump on my 40,020 gave out. One moment I was lowering the planter. The next there was a sickening whine, and the rock shaft went dead. I was miles from the shop, with 200 acres left to plant and rain in the forecast. There was no calling a dealer service truck. The bill would have been astronomical, and the wait would have been days. So I did the only thing I could do. I got out my tools. Draining 20 gallons of hydraulic fluid into 5-gallon buckets under a hot sun is a miserable job. The fluid is hot and sticky, and it seems to find its way into every crease of your skin. Then came the wrestling match with the heavy steel lines, fighting with wrenches in a space designed for a child's hands. One of the main pressure fittings was frozen solid. I put a cheetah pipe on the wrench and leaned into it with all my weight. Instead of breaking free, the head of the bolt began to round off. Frustration boiled up in my chest, hot and acidic. I threw the wrench across the field and cursed the tractor, the sky, and my own stubbornness. For a moment, I saw the appeal of Rich Peterson's life. When his new machine broke down, a clean mechanic in a clean truck showed up with a new part and had him running in an hour. But the anger passed, as it always did. I took a deep breath, walked to retrieve my wrench, and went back to work. I ended up having to use a hammer and a cold chisel to break the fitting loose, mangling it in the process. It took me 3 hours just to get the pump off. It was too heavy to carry, so I had to drive the grain truck out to the field to retrieve it. The next day was lost to the road. I drove 50 miles to a salvage yard in Grand Island, a sprawling graveyard of dead tractors. I spent hours walking through the rows of rusting hulks until I found another 4020. The pump was still on it. After another hour of greasy, knuckle-busting work, I had the part in my hand. It cost me $75, cash. By the time I got back to my farm, installed the used pump, refilled the system, and got the planter working again, I had lost a day and a half. Across the road, Peterson's new international planter, pulled by his even newer Steiger, had finished his beans and was already moving to another field. The lights on his rig blazed late into the night, a relentless, glittering symbol of progress that made my own small operation feel insignificant. I got my beans in just before the rain came, but it was a battle, a constant reminder that my path was the harder one. The mid-70s were a fever dream for American agriculture. The deal to sell massive amounts of grain to the Soviet Union had sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The old rules didn't seem to apply anymore. It felt like the good times would never end. For men like Rich Peterson, it was a golden age. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a businessman, an agricultural tycoon in the making. The soaring price of corn and beans meant his cash flow was incredible, and the banks saw him as a sure bet. Every dollar of profit he made was immediately leveraged into another loan for more land, more equipment. He bought the 320 acres that bordered his original farm, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers at the coffee shop whistle in disbelief. "He'll never make that back," they'd say. But their words lacked conviction. Everything Rich touched seemed to turn to gold. He traded in his year-old 1066 for a brand-new 4-wheel drive Steiger Panther. It was an articulated monster, a machine so large it looked like it belonged on a construction site, not a Nebraska farm. Its dual wheels stood taller than a man, and the roar of its massive Cummins diesel could be heard for miles. He bought a 24-row planter and a 50-foot field cultivator to go with it. He could now do in a single day what took me the better part of a week. The money flowed into every part of his life. He tore down the old family farmhouse and built a sprawling ranch-style home with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway. His wife drove a new Ford Country Squire station wagon with fake wood paneling on the sides. They were the embodiment of the new rural prosperity, and the whole county looked up to them. My life, by contrast, seemed to be standing still. The high grain prices were good for me, too. For the first time, I had a significant amount of money in the bank. But my father's words echoed in my ears. Good times don't last. I didn't see the boom as a chance to get bigger. I saw it as a chance to get safer. I used some of the money to put a new steel roof on the barn, paying the contractor in cash. I finally retired my old John Deere 55 combine and bought a newer, used 72700 model. It was a big step up, with a bigger grain tank and a wider header, but I found one from an estate sale and paid for it outright with the profits from 2 good harvests. The rest of the money, the vast majority of it, I put away. Not in a checking account, but in certificates of deposit at the bank, locking it in at what seemed like a decent interest rate. Sarah saw the Petersons' new house, their new car, their new life, and she grew restless. "John, we're making more money than we ever have," she said one evening as we sat on the porch. "Why can't we have a new kitchen, or at least a dishwasher? Mary Peterson has a dishwasher." I looked out at my fields, the corn standing tall and green in the fading light. "Because this won't last, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet. "And debt is a harvest that never fails. It grows in good years and bad. When this party is over, I want to be the one left standing, not the one owing the fiddler." The laughter in the county had mostly stopped. People didn't think I was a fool anymore. They just felt sorry for me. They saw me as a man who was afraid to take risks, afraid to grow, afraid to live a little. At the co-op annual meeting, Rich Peterson was elected to the board. He stood up and gave a speech about vision, about seizing the opportunities of the future. He talked about expansion and investment. He never mentioned my name, but everyone knew who he was talking about when he mentioned old-fashioned methods and a fear of progress. I just sat in the back and listened. The turning point, the first hint of a chill in the warm summer air, came subtly. I was at the bank one Friday afternoon to roll over one of my CDs. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, was a man I'd known my whole life. He was usually jovial, but that day he looked worried. He was on the phone, his voice low. "I don't care what the prime rate is in New York," he was saying. "You can't expect me to pass that on to my farmers. Their operating loans are based on 8%. What do you mean the Fed is serious this time?" He hung up the phone and wiped his brow. He saw me and forced a smile. "Just the big city bankers causing trouble, John. Nothing for you to worry about." But I had a feeling it was something to worry about. That weekend, I was reading an issue of the Farm Journal. Buried on one of the back pages was a small article, barely a column inch. It talked about runaway inflation and a new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. The article said he was determined to break inflation's back, no matter the cost. It mentioned something about tightening the money supply and letting interest rates float. The words meant little to most people. They were just economic jargon from a world away. But to me, they sounded like a distant rumble of thunder on a clear day. That evening, I stood by the fence at the edge of my property, looking west. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the distance, I could see the powerful headlights of Rich Peterson's Steiger cutting across a massive field. The deep, throaty roar of its engine carried on the still night air. It was the sound of modern agriculture, the sound of prosperity, the sound of a man farming more land than he could ever walk in a day. But as I stood there, a cold knot tightening in my stomach, it sounded less like progress and more like a warning. It was the sound of a great, hungry machine, a machine that was devouring not just diesel fuel and acres, but borrowed money and borrowed time. And I knew, deep in my bones, that a bill was coming due. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap, it was the absence of one. The spring of 1980 arrived dry and stayed that way. The sky, which should have been a turbulent canvas of grey, churning with life-giving storms, was a flat, metallic blue. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the moisture from the topsoil until it was as fine and grey as ash. I'd watch the dust devils dance across my fields, little whirlwinds of my future spiralling up into the merciless sky. I planted my corn deep, chasing the last bit of subsoil moisture, and prayed for rain. It didn't come. By June, the young stalks were stunted and pale, their leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, as if in prayer. Across the road, Rich Peterson's fields looked no better. His massive Steiger sat idle more often than not, its size a mockery in a world without water. There was no sense in burning that much expensive diesel just to cultivate dust. Then came the second blow. In January, President Carter had announced an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union. At the time, it felt distant, like a problem for politicians and international shipping companies. But by that summer, the effect had trickled down and become a flood. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been trading at over $3 a bushel plunged to $2.25. The price we were paid was suddenly less than what it cost us to grow it. The mood in the county soured. The easy optimism of the 70s evaporated like a morning dew. At the diner, the talk was no longer of new pickups and lake cabins. It was of fuel costs, fertilizer prices, and the impossible math of farming at a loss. I saw Rich Peterson there one morning. The confident smile was gone, replaced by a permanent crease of worry between his eyes. He was drinking coffee and staring out the window. But he wasn't seeing the street. He was seeing numbers, red numbers that wouldn't add up. One afternoon, I was in my shop, grinding the valves on a small Briggs & Stratton engine from my garden tiller, when I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was the high-pitched scream of stressed hydraulics, followed by a series of loud metallic bangs from the direction of Rich's place. A few minutes later, his pickup came tearing down my lane, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. He slammed to a stop and got out, his face pale under his tan. "John, you gotta help me. I need a pull." I followed him back to his field. The sight was sickening. His Steiger Panther was sitting dead in the middle of a half-disked field. One of its massive rear axles canted at a grotesque angle. A dark pool of 90-weight gear oil was spreading in the dirt beneath it. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling to look at the damage. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I was just making a turn at the end of the row, and there was a bang like a cannon shot. The whole back end just dropped." I could see the problem immediately. The planetary hub, the complex set of gears that delivered power to the giant wheels, had self-destructed. The cast-iron housing was shattered, and shards of hardened steel gear teeth were visible in the wreckage. This wasn't something you fixed with a set of wrenches in the field. This was a catastrophic failure. "You're going to have to get the dealer out here," I said. His face fell. "I called them. They can't send a service truck big enough to lift it. They said I have to get it to their shop, and they said a new planetary assembly is $12,000. If they can even find one. It might be weeks. $12,000. It was more than I'd paid for my last 3 tractors combined." He looked at my 4020, which I'd been using to mow the ditches. "Can you pull it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Just to get it to the edge of the field so I can get a lowboy trailer under it?" I looked at his tractor, a machine that weighed close to 20 tons, sunk in the soft dirt. Then I looked at my 4020, which weighed less than half that. "Rich, it'll never move it. I'll just dig 4 holes in the ground." "We have to try," he pleaded. "I can't just leave it here." So we tried. I hooked a heavy chain from my drawbar to the solid front frame of his Steiger. I put the 4020 in a low gear, eased out the clutch, and slowly tightened the chain. The engine dug in, the governor opening up as the RPMs dropped. The big tires clawed at the dry earth, and for a moment the Steiger actually lurched forward an inch. Then the 4020's wheels just spun, whining uselessly. I tried again, but it was no use. I was just polishing the dirt. We stood there in the oppressive heat, 2 men defeated by a mountain of broken steel. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of my cooling engine. Rich stared at his crippled giant, the symbol of his ambition, now just an expensive anchor in a dying field. For the first time, I didn't feel any sense of rivalry or vindication. I just felt a profound sadness for him. He had built his empire on the assumption that the machines would always run and the prices would always be high. He was discovering, in the cruelest way possible, that both of those assumptions were wrong. He had chained himself to a beast he couldn't control, and now it had turned on him. The crisis didn't arrive like a storm. It seeped in like a slow, toxic flood. The interest rates were the first wave. Mr. Henderson at the bank started looking like a ghost. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything, went from 10% to 15%, then to 20%. In December of 1980, it hit an unbelievable 21.5%. Every farmer with a variable rate operating loan, which was nearly everyone who had expanded in the 70s, was being crushed. A loan that was manageable at 8% became a death sentence at 20%. The conversations in town grew quiet and desperate. Men who had been bragging about their new combines a few years earlier were now whispering about how to tell their wives they'd received a foreclosure notice. The bulletin board at the co-op became a wall of sorrow, plastered with sale bills for farm auctions. They all read the same. Due to circumstances beyond our control, we will be selling at public auction. It was a plague, and it was taking everyone. Rich Peterson held on longer than most. He had more collateral, more momentum. But the drought, the low prices, and the crippling repair bills had wounded him badly. The new, sky-high interest rate on his massive debt was the final, mortal blow. He was selling off his calves before they were ready, taking a loss just to generate cash flow. He worked feverishly, a man possessed, his face gaunt, and his eyes hollowed out. The lights on his equipment, once a symbol of progress, now burned late into the night as a beacon of desperation. I was insulated, but not immune. The high cost of fuel and parts hurt. The low price of corn meant my profits were razor thin. But I had no debt. The checks I wrote were for diesel and seed, not for interest payments to a bank in Omaha. My farm wasn't a leveraged asset. It was just my farm. I tightened my belt. Sarah and I planted a bigger garden. We ate what we grew and we did without. While our neighbors were drowning, we were treading water. It wasn't pleasant, but we were staying afloat. My old equipment became my salvation. When the water pump on the 4020 started to leak, I didn't call a dealer. I drove to the salvage yard, pulled one off a wrecked tractor for $15, and spent an afternoon installing it myself. The Farmall M, the tractor everyone had laughed at, became my most valuable tool. It sipped gasoline compared to the diesel-guzzling 4020. I used it for everything I could, raking hay, hauling wagons, cultivating the garden. It was slow, it was uncomfortable. But every hour it ran, it saved me money I didn't have. It was a relic that was keeping me alive. The end for Rich came in the fall of '82. I saw the notice in the paper, a small, black-bordered box of text that felt like an obituary. The Farmers' National Bank was for closing. There would be an auction. All machinery, livestock, and 200 acres of prime farmland would be sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a November sky threatening a winter that everyone knew would be long and hard. The whole county was there, but the mood was the polar opposite of that sunny auction day in '74. There was no laughter, no optimism. The faces in the crowd were grim, etched with the fear that they could be next. They were there as witnesses, as mourners, and as vultures, hoping to pick up a bargain from a neighbor's ruin. Rich was there, standing off to one side with his wife. He looked like a stranger. His shoulders were slumped, his face was ashen, and he looked 10 years older. He had lost everything. The empire he had built on a mountain of debt had crumbled into dust, and the bank was there to sweep up the pieces. The auctioneer started with the equipment. The magnificent Steiger Panther, its planetary hub now repaired, sold for less than a third of what Rich had paid for it. The 24-row planter, the massive disc, piece by piece, his kingdom was dismantled for a fraction of its worth. I didn't bid. It felt wrong, like picking through the pockets of a dead man. Then came the land. It was sold in parcels. First, his home quarter, the original farm his father had passed down to him. It was bought by an out-of-state insurance company. A collective sigh went through the crowd. Another family farm lost to a corporate ledger. Finally, they offered the 320 acres that bordered my own farm to the south. The very land the extension agent had told me to borrow money to buy. The auctioneer started the bidding. The price was heartbreakingly low. Land that had been valued at $2,000 an acre during the boom was now struggling to fetch $600. I thought of the years of scraping by. I thought of my father's words. I thought of the scorn I had endured, the quiet pity in my neighbor's eyes. I thought of the certificates of deposit I had renewed year after year, the money I had saved instead of spent. I raised my hand. The auctioneer's eyes locked onto mine. "I have a bid," he called out. A lawyer representing the insurance company countered. The auctioneer looked back at me. I nodded. We went back and forth, the price climbing in small, painful increments. The crowd was dead silent. Every eye was on me, the quiet man with the old tractors. Finally, the lawyer shook his head. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot in the cold air. "To John Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't a sound of celebration, but of shock, of a world turned upside down. I had just bought my neighbor's dream, the foundation of his fallen empire, and I had paid cash. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a heavy, somber sense of responsibility. I walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers. As I finished, I saw Rich standing alone by his pickup truck, his wife having already driven away. He was just staring at the ground, a man hollowed out by failure. I walked over to him. He didn't look up. "Rich," I said softly. He finally raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Come to gloat, John. Come to tell me you told me so." "No," I said. "I came to ask you for help." He looked at me, confused. "Help? I've got nothing left." "That's not true," I said. "You've got knowledge. You know that ground I just bought better than anyone. You know where the wet spots are, where the soil is thin. I'm going to need a man to help me farm it next spring, a man who knows what he's doing." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, trying to process what I was saying. I wasn't offering him charity. I was offering him a job. I was offering him a shred of the dignity that had been stripped from him. "And another thing," I said, pulling a set of keys from my pocket. They were the keys to the old Farm All M. "The bank took your pickup. You're going to need a way to get around. It's not much, but it runs. You can use it. Pay me back when you get on your feet." Tears welled up in his eyes, and for the first time that day, they weren't tears of despair. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, taking the keys from my outstretched hand. We stood there for a long moment, two farmers on a cold November day, bound not by victory or defeat, but by the shared, unforgiving love of the land. I hadn't just bought a piece of his farm. I had bought a piece of his future, and I was determined to make sure it was one he could be a part of. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip on the heartland. Prices stabilized, and the rains returned. Rich worked for me for 2 seasons, his knowledge of that new ground proving invaluable. He was a good hand, a hard worker. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. We never spoke of the auction again. We just worked, side by side, 2 men wresting a living from the same soil. Eventually, he saved up enough money to buy a small, used tractor and started doing custom work for other farmers. He rebuilt his life, not as an emperor of acres, but as a respected man who knew his trade. We remained friends, a friendship forged in the crucible of failure and forgiveness. My own life didn't change much. With the new land, my farm was now a respectable size, but I ran it the same way I always had. I bought newer equipment as the old stuff wore out, but always used, and always for cash. Sarah finally got her new kitchen, dishwasher, and all. She never complained about my cautious ways again. The community's perception of me shifted. I was no longer poor John, the man stuck in the past. I was just John, the man who had weathered the storm. Younger farmers would sometimes stop by the shop, asking for advice. I never told them what to do. I just told them my father's words. The bank is a partner you can't fire. Years later, when I was in my 60s and my own son, Michael, was starting to take over the farm, he was in the shop with me. I was teaching him how to set the timing on the old Farm All M, which I still kept, more for sentiment than for work. It was greasy, meticulous work, turning the flywheel by hand to line up the timing marks. "Dad," Michael said, wiping his hands on a rag, "why do we keep this old thing? It's slow, it's noisy, and the 7710 can do everything it does 10 times faster." I stopped what I was doing and looked at the old tractor, its paint faded, its steel seat worn smooth by decades of use. I ran my hand over the warm hood. "This tractor isn't about speed, son," I said. "It's about freedom. See this?" I rapped my knuckles on the cast-iron engine block. "We own this. Every nut, every bolt, every gear. It's not listed as collateral on some banknote in a file cabinet 100 miles away. When you sit on this seat, the only person you're beholden to is yourself and the good Lord above." I looked at my son, hoping he would understand the depth of what I was saying. In the good times, I continued. Everyone forgets that. They get caught up in the race for more, for bigger, for newer. They chain themselves to debt, thinking it's a tool. But when the hard times come, and they always come, that tool becomes a weapon turned against you. This old iron, this land, everything we have that's paid for, that's the real harvest. It's a harvest of peace of mind, and that's a crop that never fails. Michael was quiet for a long time, looking from the old tractor to me. Then a slow smile spread across his face, a smile of understanding. He picked up the wrench. "All right," he said. "Show me how to set that magneto one more time. I want to make sure I get it right." And as I watched my son's hands, still clean and young, learn the patient work of maintaining the old machine, I knew the most important lesson had been passed on. It wasn't about farming more acres or having the biggest tractor. It was about owning your life, free and clear. And in the quiet hum of my debt-free farm, under the vast Nebraska sky, that was a legacy worth more than all the money in the world.